Detective Harris, seasoned by years of service on the streets, always believed that he could recognize the culprit at a glance. His instincts rarely failed, especially when it came to a certain type of person. So when he saw a homeless black man on the corner, something inside him lit up. He was sure that this was a criminal. Without a second thought, Harris arrested him, not even suspecting that within a day this incident would turn his life upside down. What do you think happened next? Write your guesses in the comments. And by the way, from what city are you watching this video? After the arrest, the homeless man was taken to the police station, where Harris felt his usual satisfaction. He was sure he had done the right thing. The man looked suspicious, old, torn clothes, dirt on his face. Looking away, Harris didn't ask questions, didn't think about who this man might be beyond his appearance. To him, it was obvious, another vagrant, maybe a thief or a drug addict. However, the next morning everything changed. When the detective arrived at the station, he was called by his superior, whose face expressed grave concern. He silently handed Harris a folder containing the arrestee's personal data. The detective leafed through the papers and was surprised to see that the file in front of him was different from what he had expected. The arrestee was a former doctor named James Anderson. He had once run a successful clinic and had an impeccable reputation. Even more surprisingly, Anderson was a war veteran who had been decorated for bravery. Harris was stunned. He tried to understand how a man with such a history could end up on the streets. The answer came with further investigation. After returning from the war, Anderson suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which had destroyed his personal life and career. Illness, lack of support, the loss of his home, all of it had led him to a life on the streets. But none of this suffering had changed who he had been before. The detective felt a deep sense of shame. He had to admit that he had been driven by racial prejudice and had not even tried to find out the truth about a man he had judged by his appearance and the color of his skin. Everything was black and white for him. Arrest him because he was obviously guilty. Harris realized that his prejudices had blinded him to the reality and depth of human destinies. This story opened his eyes to his own misconceptions. Racism is not only overt hatred or discrimination, it is also a hidden prejudice that can influence our decisions, causing us to judge people by their appearance, without realizing that behind every face, skin color, or social status lies a real story. Racism is a social disease that undermines human relationships and justice. For Harris, it was a lesson in how stereotypes deprive people of their right to be understood and respected. And while he couldn't change what he had done, the story forced him to rethink his attitude toward work, toward people, and toward himself. James Anderson's story was more than just one man's tragedy. It was a challenge to an entire system that often judges people by their appearance and social status without giving them a chance to be heard. Harris realized that true justice cannot exist if we allow our prejudices to dictate our decisions. Every person has the right to be respected and understood, no matter what they look like or how much money they have. Detective Harris couldn't shake what he'd learned about James Anderson. Every detail of his life, every step that had led him to homelessness, showed how unfair circumstances could be. But what hurt Harris most was the realization that his own behavior had been part of that unfairness. When he saw Anderson again in the interrogation room, he had a new feeling, not the arrogance and confidence with which he had arrested the man on the street, but a mixture of regret and respect. Anderson sat quietly, his face showing neither the anger nor the despair that one might expect. His eyes seemed to see more than just the cold walls of the station, as if he had resigned himself to the blows life was dealing him one by one. "I came to apologize," Harris began, struggling to find the words. He had never been in this situation before. Anderson looked at him with mild surprise, but remained silent, giving the detective a chance to continue. I was wrong. I judged you based on how you looked. I didn't know your history. I didn't know who you were. But even if I had, it doesn't excuse what I did." Harris paused, hoping Anderson would understand. He knew that an apology wouldn't change his actions, but it was the beginning of something important for him. Anderson finally spoke, his voice quiet but dignified. "You're not the first person to judge me. People do it a lot. When you're on the street, you're invisible, and at the same time, the most visible. Everyone sees you as a threat or a nuisance, but no one sees you as a person." The words struck Harris. It became clear to him that the bias he had experienced was just the tip of the iceberg. Anderson was a victim of a system and a society where the color of one's skin and social status too often determine how one is treated. Anderson continued, "When I came back from the war, I thought I would be greeted as a hero. Instead, I was met with disdain, as if what I had done didn't matter because I was black. My experiences, my accomplishments, all of that meant nothing to people who only saw in me what they wanted to see." Those words made Harris look at himself even more critically. He realized that his actions were part of a larger problem, deeply rooted in society. He had been raised in a culture where skin color and social status determined who was dangerous and who was trustworthy, and while he had considered himself a good cop, sincerely seeking to uphold the law, he now realized that he had been blind to how biases shaped his decisions. "I thought I knew how the world worked," Harris said quietly, "but it seems there's a lot I haven't seen." "The world is complicated," Anderson replied, looking the detective straight in the eye, "and if we want to change anything, we have to start by seeing more in people than just their appearance." For Harris, these words were not just a lesson, but a call to action. He realized that he had to rethink not only his personal views, but also his work. Being a detective is not only about finding criminals and upholding the law, it is also about seeing the truth behind the facade of prejudice and stereotypes. And perhaps most importantly, it is about working on yourself to truly serve justice. When Harris left the interrogation room, his steps were heavy, but there was a new feeling in his soul. He knew he had a long way to go. The apology was just the beginning. He would have to change not only his own views, but also help others see that racism and bias are invisible barriers that must be torn down every day. And it had to start with him. After his conversation with James Anderson, something inside Harris was nagging at him. He couldn't go back to work as if nothing had happened. As the days passed, Anderson's story haunted him. The detective realized he was dealing with more than just an isolated injustice, but a much deeper, more systemic problem. Racism permeated the very fabric of society. Every action, decision, and interaction, even if it was subtle. Harris soon decided to dig deeper into Anderson's story. He found the doctor's former colleagues, spoke with his family, and pieced together a full picture of the man's life. The more he learned, the more he felt guilty and responsible for how easily he had allowed himself to judge another man without knowing anything about his life beyond his appearance. James Anderson's story was tragic, but sadly not unique. He was not the first black veteran to return from war and face an invisible wall of racism despite his service and bravery. Harris learned that Anderson, like so many others, was unable to get help when he needed it. After returning from the war, James was denied mental health services, access to which was limited for black veterans, and bureaucratic barriers only made matters worse. The system that was supposed to protect heroes had cast him aside because he didn't fit the mold. The more Harris delved into this world, the more he realized that racism wasn't just a matter of the attitudes of individuals like him. It was something much bigger. It was an invisible web that spanned everything from healthcare to justice, from education to work. White people like Harris often didn't have to notice this web because it didn't directly affect them. But for people like Anderson, it was a constant trap they couldn't escape, no matter how hard they tried. One day, while poring over old reports, Harris came across a statistic that gave him pause. Black men in his city were arrested at 4 times the rate of white men, despite the fact that the crime rates for both groups were virtually identical. It was proof that the biases he had previously dismissed as insignificant were actually shaping reality, a reality in which people like Anderson suffered because they were labeled without protection or understanding. Harris began to notice these biases in his colleagues, too, in their conversations, their actions, their attitudes towards suspects. When a black man showed up at a station, many already assumed he was guilty. They didn't say it out loud, but their actions spoke louder than words. Harris recalled how he had followed these patterns himself, how he automatically assumed the worst about people he didn't even know. But now everything had changed. Harris could no longer work while ignoring the problem he saw so clearly. He decided to start with himself, and began studying the literature on systemic racism. He needed to understand how such biases had become embedded in society, why they were so deeply ingrained, and how they could be eradicated. He also reached out to organizations that work to combat racial discrimination. These conversations helped him realize that the only way to combat racism was to acknowledge its existence and work to eliminate it. But Harris's journey hasn't been easy. When he began to change his ways, not all of his colleagues were sympathetic. Many laughed at his attempts to be overly civil, thinking he was overdoing it. Others confronted him openly, saying racism is a myth and that they were just doing their jobs. For them, the justice system worked because they didn't see it ruining the lives of people like Anderson. These conversations were difficult and often contentious, but Harris refused to back down. A few months after that fateful arrest, Harris learned that Anderson's case had gained public attention, thanks to the efforts of several activists. James's story had gained publicity, and his case had become a symbol of the fight against racial injustice in the justice system. Authorities launched an investigation into the biased arrests, and Harris was among those who publicly supported the investigation, acknowledging his own mistakes and calling for change. Harris could no longer just be a bystander. He realized that his job as a detective was not just about fighting crime, but also about fighting the injustice that could hide behind the guise of law. Systemic racism was not just the fault of individuals, but the result of a culture that had fostered bias and stereotypes for centuries, and Harris realized that if he wanted to make a difference, he would have to fight that culture every day, starting with himself and his actions. The story of James Anderson changed the detective forever. It became a starting point for him, not only in his professional activities, but also in his personal life. Harris decided that he would never again allow himself to judge a person by their appearance, social status, or skin color. This case taught him the most important thing: justice must be blind to prejudice. This is the only way to truly protect all people, regardless of their origin. Anderson was exonerated and given the help he needed. But for Harris, it wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a long journey. Detective Harris sat in his car in front of his house. It was dark outside, with only street lights to illuminate the empty street, but his thoughts were even darker. He couldn't get the consequences of his actions out of his head. James Anderson's story was gaining momentum. At first it was just a local conversation, but soon the journalists were reading about the unfair arrest. Article after article exposed systemic racism in the police force, and Harris's name was mentioned as an example of an officer who, without even realizing it, had become a symbol of the problem. The phone calls from internal affairs became regular, and the pressure grew stronger. Harris knew his career was at risk. There was talk of disciplinary action, possible demotion, or even dismissal. His colleagues, the very ones who had once been his support and family, began to view him with suspicion and contempt. Many felt he had betrayed his own by supporting an investigation into police racism. Others, on the contrary, saw him as the main culprit. But the hardest part was that it all began to take its toll on his family. One night, returning home late from yet another interrogation, Harris found his wife Karen sitting in the dark. She rarely waited for him so late, and from the look on her face, he knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," she began, her voice shaking. Harris felt a cold lump in his stomach. He already knew this conversation would be difficult. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, holding up her phone. "They're talking about you again. They're saying you're a racist, that you should never have worn a badge. Our kids have seen it. They're being asked about it at school. Do you realize what this does to us?" Harris looked down. He didn't know how to respond. He thought he had done the right thing by admitting his mistake, by trying to change the system from within, but at this moment he wasn't sure if it was worth it. "Karen, I didn't mean for this to happen," he began quietly. "I just can't keep turning a blind eye to what's happening. It's wrong. James Anderson, he shouldn't have been arrested. I was wrong, and not just me, the whole system." Karen clenched her hands, her face tense. "I know you're trying to do good, but it's destroying us." She looked at him with pained eyes. "You changed, and now everything has changed. People hate us. I can't leave the house without hearing whispers behind my back. The kids come home crying. They say their dad is a monster." Those words hit him harder than any accusations from the police or the public. He saw how this was starting to tear apart his family, the people he loved most, his career, justice. All that was important, but what if he lost what really mattered? Yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't just back down. If he gave in now, he'd not only be betraying Anderson and the others who had experienced injustice, he'd be betraying himself. He couldn't live any longer pretending that the world was a simple place where law and order were always fair. A few weeks later, the case came to a head. James Anderson, still homeless despite the attention to his story, sued the police department for wrongful arrest. Harris was called as a key witness. That day was a turning point. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, police officers, all waiting to see what would happen next. Harris sat in the dock, cold sweat on his forehead. When he was called to testify, he stood up, feeling the weight of every step. "Detective Harris," Anderson's attorney began, "can you describe what happened the day you arrested my client?" Harris sighed. He knew this was the moment when he was required to be completely honest, no matter the consequences. He looked at Anderson in the audience, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no malice or hatred in Anderson's eyes, only anticipation. "I arrested him," Harris began slowly, "because I saw him as a stereotype, not a man. I didn't ask his name. I didn't try to figure out who he really was. I saw a homeless black man and I assumed he was guilty. It was a mistake. It was racism, not overt, but deep-seated in my mind." There was a tense silence in the room. Harris continued, "Over the years of working in the police, I absorbed biases that I did not realize, but now I understand how harmful they are. We are used to judging people by their appearance, by the color of their skin, and this is not only my fault, it is a problem of the entire system, which pits us against those we are supposed to protect." The words were finally spoken out loud. Harris could see that many of those present were starting to get nervous. His superiors, his colleagues, they were clearly not ready for such admissions. But for Harris, this was a moment of truth for which he was willing to pay any price. After his testimony, the jury ruled in Anderson's favor. It was one man's first victory in the pursuit of justice, but Harris knew the fight had just begun. The case became a symbol of how racism can only be defeated through honesty, self-reflection, and the rejection of ingrained prejudices. For Harris, it was a bitter realization that his police career was likely over. But he couldn't live any other way. He had lost his friends. He was an outcast. His family was still suffering from the pressures of society. But deep down, he knew he had made the right choice. And although the road to real change was long and difficult, he believed that this step was the first on the path to a better future. Harris soon left the police. He could no longer remain in a system that refused to change. But his story did not end there. He began working with community organizations, helping other victims of injustice, continuing the fight against racism and discrimination, but from the other side. And although he had lost a lot, he knew one thing for sure: he had found what he had not had before: truth and faith in justice. After Harris left the police force, his life changed dramatically. He no longer wore a uniform, no longer stood guard over the law, as he had for years, but that did not mean that his fight against injustice was over. On the contrary, it had only just begun. Every morning he woke up feeling as if the whole world was against him, and every morning he asked himself, was it worth it? But when he thought about James Anderson, about those who never got justice, his doubts disappeared. One day, at a rally against police brutality, Harris was approached by a young activist named Tyrone. He was a determined and brave guy in his 20s, with fire in his eyes and a firm determination to change the system. Tyrone knew Harris's story and wanted him to join their movement. "You know," Tyrone began, holding up a sign that read "Justice for All," "I didn't believe at first that a cop like you could change, but your story got me thinking. We need someone like you who knows the system from the inside." Harris stared at the young man for a long moment, feeling both pride and doubt. He knew that accepting the offer would plunge him deeper into a struggle that could ultimately destroy his life. He had already lost his job. Many of his former colleagues had turned against him, and his family remained under pressure. But Tyrone was right: the system would never change unless those who understood it from the inside took action. "I'll help," Harris finally said, "but you must know that this will be a dirty game. The system is resisting, and the more we push it, the more it will respond." Tyrone nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Harris was needed by their movement not only as a former cop, but as someone who knew how racism permeated every level of justice. Meanwhile, the situation in the city was heating up. The police were tightening their grip on the protesters. Unrest was spreading to every neighborhood. Every day brought new reports of violent arrests, of people being detained on suspicion simply because of the color of their skin. Harris was seeing what he had recently fought against unfold before his eyes with terrifying speed. One evening, after a particularly tense rally where police used tear gas, Harris was approached by one of his former colleagues, Detective Mark Rowles, a man he had worked alongside for nearly a decade. "You shouldn't have done that, Harris," Mark said reproachfully, his voice cold and harsh. "You betrayed us all. You think you've done something great? Now you're on the wrong side of the fence, and they won't protect you when things go south." Harris looked at Mark, trying to keep his emotions in check. He knew that his decision to subpoena Anderson, his outspokenness against systemic racism, had been perceived as a betrayal, but that didn't matter anymore. "I did what I had to do," Harris said calmly. "I wasn't defending the system, I was defending justice, and if you don't understand that, Mark, then you're part of the problem." Mark chuckled, but there was pain in his eyes. He was not used to seeing Harris on the other side. It seemed as if they were now standing on opposite poles, although they had once been inseparable partners. "We're not friends anymore, Harris. Don't be surprised if you find yourself in the crosshairs one day. You chose this path yourself." The words struck Harris. He knew that everything he was doing was tearing his life apart, but he had no choice. He could no longer accept what he saw every day, the injustice that crippled people like James Anderson. A few weeks later, something happened that changed everything. On the evening after one of the largest rallies in the city center, police ambushed protesters. Harris was among those trying to help people get off the streets when everything turned chaotic. The crowd ran, people screamed, and the sound of sirens tore through the night. Police threw tear gas, not distinguishing whether they were peaceful protesters or provocateurs. That's when Harris saw Tyrone surrounded. The young activist was trying to protect a woman who had fallen to the ground, but one of the police officers lunged at him with a baton. Harris ran towards them, screaming for him to stop, but it was too late. The blow landed squarely on Tyrone's head, and he collapsed on the pavement. In that moment, Harris's stomach turned. He remembered being that cop, acting mindlessly out of fear and prejudice. Now he saw the consequences of what the system did when left unchecked. Tyrone was taken to hospital with serious injuries and was in critical condition. Harris sat in the hallway, waiting for news, feeling a huge weight of guilt on his shoulders. This was no random incident, it was the result of a system he had protected for years before he saw the light. When the doctor finally came out, his face was serious. "We did everything we could," he said, "but Tyrone didn't survive." The words stunned Harris. He sat in the hallway, unable to move, realizing that a young man who had just begun to fight for justice had been killed by the very system he was trying to change. Tyrone had become a victim of what they all stood against. Anger and pain filled Harris. He knew he could no longer stand by. Tyrone was just one of many, and his death should not have been in vain. This fight was now personal for Harris. The next day he called a press conference. In front of journalists, activists and police he declared, Tyrone's death was not an accident. He was a victim of a system that has spent years protecting its own instead of upholding justice. I was part of that system, and I know how it works, but I will not remain silent any longer. We will not stop until every person in this city is equal before the law, no matter their color or status. The words were a challenge. Harris knew it could cost him everything, his safety, his family, even his life, but he couldn't stop anymore. Tyrone's death was the last straw. The fight against racism and injustice was now his only goal. And although danger and possible confrontation with former colleagues awaited him, Harris was ready to go to the end, understanding that justice does not always come easy, but it is worth fighting for. The day after the press conference, Harris was surrounded by reporters as he left the building, but he ignored them. His mind was racing with thoughts about how to continue the fight, how to make sure Tyrone's death was not in vain. He knew that after his statement, the police would become even more aggressive, and although he was prepared for the consequences, the uncertainty was depressing. A few days later, an anonymous call came into his phone. The number was hidden, the voice was muted. The stranger said he had important information about what happened to Tyrone that night. It alarmed Harris, but something inside him told him that the call couldn't be ignored. "If you want to know the truth, come to the warehouse on the outskirts of the city," the voice said and hung up. The warehouses on the outskirts had long been known as a place of illegal dealings, and Harris knew it was dangerous to go there, but the intuition that had saved him so often before told him that something important was waiting there. He arrived at night, to remain unnoticed. It was quiet, only the faint moonlight illuminated the old rusty gates. The warehouse was abandoned, but the doors were slightly open. Harris walked inside cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "I'm here," came a voice from the darkness. A tall man stepped out from the corner, wearing a hood and a mask. Despite his hidden appearance, Harris sensed that the stranger was somehow connected to the police. This was no ordinary man from the street. "What do you have?" Harris asked, straining. "The truth you seek is not as simple as you think," the man began, removing his mask. The face was familiar. It was Michael Carson, one of the most powerful officers on the force, who had previously worked in the Internal Affairs Division. He was known for his toughness and iron grip, but Harris couldn't understand why Carson, a man of the system, would come to him with such information. "You? What do you want?" Harris asked suspiciously. Carson stepped closer, lowering his hood. "I've been a part of this case from the beginning. Tyrone was not a random victim, Harris. His death was not just a tragic accident. He was killed on purpose." Harris froze. The words hit him like a bolt of lightning. Tyrone hadn't just died in a crowd of protesters. He'd been deliberately killed. But why? For what? And by whom? "Why are you telling me this? You're part of the system," Harris almost shouted, feeling anger boiling inside. Carson looked down, his voice quieter. "You don't understand. What's going on is much deeper than you can imagine. There's a group within the police that controls everything. They run not just the department, but everything that happens in the city." They knew that Tyrone wasn't just an activist. He had information that couldn't be made public. "What information?" Harris asked, feeling his world begin to crumble even more. Carson took a deep breath. Tyrone learned that many of the protests that turned violent are orchestrated by the police themselves. This is done to justify crackdowns, suppression of activists, and ultimately to maintain control. They eliminate those who know too much, and Tyrone was one of them. He had become too much of a threat. Harris took a step back, stunned by what he had heard. He found it hard to breathe. This information turned everything on its head. It seemed that all this time, even after he had come over to the side of the fight for justice, he had underestimated how deeply corrupt the system was. And now it turned out that his former colleagues were not only engaging in racist practices, but were actually plotting against those who opposed them. "But why are you telling me this?" Harris finally managed to squeeze out. "What do you want?" Carson looked him straight in the eye. "Because I was part of it too, and now I can't live with it. I need the evidence you have. I know you've been collecting information about what happened that night. If we join forces, we can bring this group down from within. But time is short. They already know I want out of the game, and they'll be looking for you, too." At that moment, Harris realized he was on the edge of an abyss. He was about to be drawn into a war deeper and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And now it was not just a question of justice for Tyrone, but of how to destroy the entire network of people who controlled the city. "I have the security footage," Harris said, finally realizing that Carson might be his only chance to expose all of this. "But you have to help me. They won't stop until they destroy everyone who tries to expose their secrets." Carson nodded, his face grim but determined. "We'll start with those above us. You'll see how deep this goes." But just as Harris was about to continue the conversation, the warehouse doors slammed open and headlights illuminated the room. Several men in black suits, armed to the teeth, entered. Harris only had time to exchange a quick glance with Carson before a muffled gunshot rang out. Carson collapsed to the floor. Harris stood there, frozen, his heart pounding. He knew the next few minutes would decide everything. The second the shot rang out, Harris instinctively dropped to the floor and pressed himself against the wall, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. The guards who entered the warehouse began to methodically search the room. their flashlights sliding along shelves and corners. Harris knew that if he was discovered, there was no chance of escape. He looked at Carson, who was lying on the floor, blood slowly spreading, and knew he had to act quickly. With difficulty, hiding behind boxes, Harris crept out of the warehouse through a side exit, which, fortunately, was not far from where he was. On the street, he ducked into the shadows, watching as the guards continued to search for him. His mind was boiling. He was not only shocked by Carson's death, but also understood that his life was now in danger. He needed to find a safe place and gather all the evidence he had. His old computer contained videos and documents that confirmed police involvement in organizing protests and violence. This data could be the key to exposing the entire system, but now it was under threat. Harris spent several days hiding, moving around the city and avoiding surveillance. He found an old friend who worked in IT and could help him save and encrypt the data. They met in an abandoned office building, where his friend, Max, was able to quickly transfer all of his important files to a secure server, hidden from prying eyes. "This data is the only thing we have to expose them," Max said when the job was done, "but you have to be prepared for them to come looking for you. The police and these people, they'll stop at nothing." "I understand," Harris said, "but if we don't do anything, things will continue as they were before. I need to show what really happened. Otherwise, Carson and Tyrone's deaths will go unpunished." Meanwhile, a manhunt for Harris began in the city. The police put him on the wanted list, charging him with arson, rioting, and even murder. The media blew the whistle, portraying him as a dangerous criminal, which only made his situation worse. Harris was still planning his next move when an unexpected twist occurred. One morning, while checking the news on an old cell phone, he came across an article that said Carson had recorded a video message before his death. In the message, he not only revealed details of his involvement in the conspiracy, but also provided evidence that high-profile police officers were connected to a criminal organization that was manipulating events in the city. The video was posted on an anonymous website and quickly spread across social media. The chemistry of the scandal was uncovered like a thunderclap. An official investigation had been launched, and despite the police's best efforts to suppress the information, the public was now demanding the truth. Harris knew his situation was becoming even more precarious, but now he had something that could change the situation: Carson's video. To protect his life and his mission, Harris decided to seize the moment and use the public attention to his advantage. He contacted several independent journalists who had already covered the protests and police violence. With the help of his new allies, he organized a press conference to show the world the evidence that Carson and he had collected. "We all see what's happening in our city," Harris began as he gathered himself in front of the camera. "But what you don't see is that many of the people who are supposed to protect us are using us for their own purposes. These tapes prove that the system is corrupt to its very core." He played a video of Carson. A pale but determined Carson appeared on the screen, explaining how police forces manipulate events and eliminate those who pose a threat. Harris immediately followed with his own evidence regarding the organization of protests and violence. The global community and independent human rights organizations exploded with reaction. Countries around the world began to pay attention to police corruption. Protests and marches broke out not only in the city, but around the world. People demanded real change. The police came under enormous pressure. Local authorities were forced to launch internal investigations. High-profile officers linked to the plot were suspended and many were arrested. Street protests and public pressure helped further expose and reform the justice system. Harris, though still on the run, felt his efforts had not been in vain. He continued to collaborate with journalists and human rights activists, passing on any information he could. He knew he might never be able to return to a normal life, but now his fight had given hope to those who still suffered from systemic injustice. Tyrone and Carson became symbols of the change that was needed. Although they died, their sacrifices led to important changes that began to touch every corner of the city. Harris knew that their fight had not been in vain, and despite his loss and the uncertainty of the future, he was confident that they had done the right thing. After the press conference, Harris felt like he was finally moving a mountain, but with that feeling came even greater danger. The release of Carson's video message and the disclosure of the evidence had caused a public outcry. but it also had unintended consequences. Those behind the network of corrupt police and mafia structures now saw Harris as the main enemy. His face was constantly on TV screens and in newspapers. The public was divided. Some saw him as a hero who exposed the system. Others saw him as a traitor and a target. The pressure was mounting. The press continued to cover the scandal, but on the streets of the city a real war was unfolding. The police, unofficially but with the tacit approval of the top brass, intensified their persecution of activists. People who supported Harris disappeared or were falsely accused. Every step seemed more dangerous to Harris. Realizing that he needed to move quickly, he continued to hide, constantly changing locations and avoiding the city's CCTV cameras. One night, while he was in a small apartment in a rundown part of town, one of the activists, Jennifer, with whom he had worked before, came to him. She looked worried, her eyes full of worry. "Harris," she began as soon as she entered the room, "I've learned something that may shock you. They're planning a hit on you, but not just any hit. They want to make it look like you were part of the crime ring you were exposing. They want to wipe your name clean." Harris listened to her in silence, a cold sweat running down his skin. This was no longer just a fight for justice, it was now a game of survival. It was only a matter of time before he was eliminated. "How did you know about this?" he asked, clenching his fists. "I spoke to one of the officers. He was in contact with the internal structures, but he is afraid that he will be removed too. He says that you need to disappear immediately." But disappearing was impossible. Harris knew that if he disappeared, all the evidence and all the effort would go to waste. But before he could respond, Jennifer added, "There's something else. I didn't know if I should tell you, but..." Tyrone wasn't just an activist. He was the son of a powerful senator, and they knew it. He used his position to push for investigations into police brutality. He tried to bring attention to systemic abuses at the highest levels, but he was taken out before he could do so publicly. The information hit Harris like a punch in the gut. He remembered the young, determined man he had started the fight with, and now he realized there was more at stake than he had ever imagined. Tyrone's murder had not been a simple act of cruelty. It had been a carefully orchestrated cover-up at the highest levels. The senator was not just a father who had lost his son. He was part of a political machine that controlled all the corrupt schemes. The senator couldn't have not known what was going on, Harris said, gritting his teeth. He may have known about the plot, but he turned a blind eye to avoid ruining his career. "I'm not sure," Jennifer replied. "I have information that he has started his own investigation, but you have to be careful. These people will do anything to shut you and him up." Harris realized that there were now even more dangerous forces at play. If Tyrone was indeed political, it meant that it wasn't just the police that were involved, but the highest levels of government. The racism he saw in the justice system was just the tip of the iceberg. He found himself at the center of a struggle for control of the city, for the preservation of power and privilege for the elite. Harris decided to be proactive. He knew that if he was found, it would be the end of him, but he also realized that he had a chance to turn the tables if he could get in touch with the senator, Tyrone's father. If he was indeed investigating, joining forces could open more doors and take the case to the next level. He sent Jennifer on a mission to contact the senator through anonymous channels and give him some of the evidence he had collected. But before she could complete the task, the situation changed dramatically. One morning, as Harris was crossing a deserted avenue, he was suddenly blinded by the headlights of several cars. Armed men in black clothes jumped out, clearly not police. They were well prepared, moving precisely and quickly. Harris tried to run away, but they surrounded him. One of the rough-faced men, who seemed to be the leader, came closer. "We know you tried to play against the system," he said with a smirk, "but you chose the wrong side. You had plenty of chances to shut up, but now your time is up." Harris braced himself for the worst. He knew his chances of survival were slim, but he couldn't afford to give up. At that moment, shots suddenly rang out, but not from the gunmen. Several of them fell to the ground, and then Harris saw men in bulletproof vests with the words FBI written on them rush into the firefight. It turned out that Jennifer had not only given the evidence to the senator, but had also contacted federal authorities. It was a risky move, but in the end it worked. Harris was saved at the last moment. The FBI took over the case, and that was the beginning of the end for those behind the plot. The senator, who had lost his son, finally decided to publicly speak out against the city administration and the police. His words shocked the entire country. The revelation of the connections between high-ranking officials and corrupt police officers shook society. Mass arrests began, and journalists gained access to new evidence. Harris, though still protected, knew his life would never be the same. He could no longer be part of normal society. Too many enemies, too many threats, but he knew he had made the right choice. Despite all the losses, the fight against racism and corruption in the city was far from over. But now, thanks to Harris, Tyrone, and Carson, people were seeing the truth. The system was beginning to crumble, and a glimmer of hope was finally lit in the fight. Several months had passed since Harris had been rescued by the FBI. The city that had once been a center of tension now resembled a battleground for the truth. Each day brought new revelations about corruption and systemic racism that involved not only police officers, but also judges, businessmen, and politicians. The media continued to spin the case, and not only local activists, but also national human rights organizations joined the fight for justice. But even after all the revelations, Harris could not feel relief. He was still hidden in the safety of the Witness Protection Program, and although his name was now known to everyone, he himself remained out of the public eye. But one day his peace was disturbed again. In one of the secret apartments where Harris was hiding, he was visited by the FBI agent with whom he had been working all this time. The agent looked wary, as if he was bringing important news. "Harris, we have a problem," he said, "sitting down across from you. We've intercepted information that despite the arrests and exposures, there is a group inside the system that continues to operate. They are planning a strike that could have catastrophic consequences, and this time, they are targeting you directly." "I'm used to being hunted," Harris nodded. "But what do you mean?" The agent hesitated for a second before continuing. "We got information from an insider. You should know that the senator, Tyrone's father, was involved in much more crime than we thought. His career was based on his ties to the very organization you were fighting against. He supported the system he was supposedly exposing. His involvement in the expose was an attempt to divert suspicion from himself, to disguise himself as a hero. But there is evidence that he helped cover up murders and helped finance police officers who carried out attacks on activists." Harris felt the ground slipping from under his feet. The senator he had considered his ally in this fight turned out to be just another link in the system he wanted to destroy. "But that's impossible." Harris stood up and began to pace the room, his thoughts in chaos. "He lost his son. I thought he was sincerely trying to uncover the truth." "We all thought the same," the agent sighed. "But it's more complicated than that. Tyrone didn't know the full truth about his father's deeds. He was an idealist and fought for justice. But when the senator realized that Tyrone was going to publicly expose not only the police, but the entire conspiracy, he made the decision to eliminate his own son." The words hit Harris like lightning. It was worse than he could have ever imagined. Tyrone had died not at the hands of a police officer for his quest for the truth, but because his own father had chosen to protect his own dark deeds. "I have to make this public," Harris said, trying to compose himself. "People have to know." "It's not that simple," the agent shook his head. "If you come forward now, they can make a target out of you and completely discredit you. The senator has enormous resources and influence, and he's already started an operation to turn you into a villain. If they do that before you can come forward, no one will listen to you." Harris realized that he was trapped again. The enemy he was fighting was not only more powerful, but also far more cunning. Now his main opponent was the man he considered an ally. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in the city. After a series of revelations and protests, it became known that the senator's closest allies were involved in a major financial scam involving shady deals. New unrest was brewing in society, and a group of activists supporting Harris decided to organize another march. Harris knew this could be a pivotal moment. He gathered the last remaining evidence to prove the senator's involvement in the conspiracy and, with the help of journalists, decided to prepare a large story. The article had to come out simultaneously with a major protest, so that the revelation of the truth would have maximum resonance. But before the story came out, something unexpected happened. That night, as the march was in full swing, people began receiving text messages on their phones from an anonymous source. The messages contained fabricated documents and fake videos of Harris allegedly admitting to working with criminal organizations. The messages spread like wildfire, and soon the entire country was talking about Harris as a criminal and a perjurer who was trying to destroy the senator's reputation for his own selfish purposes. It was a carefully planned attack, and it began to work. Public opinion began to shift, and people began to doubt the veracity of Harris's words. Many of those who had previously supported him began to turn away. Harris found himself isolated. The media he trusted refused to publish his story for fear of repercussions. Criminal cases were brought against him on trumped-up charges. It seemed as if all his efforts to expose the system had been in vain. But at his darkest moment, when Harris was on the brink of despair, something happened that changed the game. One morning, while watching the news, he saw a video that instantly captured the world's attention. It was the senator himself, recanting his words and admitting to his role in the murder of his son and numerous crimes. This video was released by his own daughter, Tyrone's sister. She, having learned the truth about what happened to her brother, decided to speak out against her father. Her appeal was powerful and touching. She told how, having learned about the betrayal, she could no longer remain silent. Despite threats and fear for her life, the senator was exposed. His influence collapsed in a matter of hours. The people who had previously supported him turned away. A huge scandal erupted, and the city was once again on the brink of protests. Harris felt that justice had finally been served. He knew there was still much fighting to do, but now he had a powerful ally, the truth, which could no longer be hidden. The senator was exposed, his career was crumbling, and the streets of the city were once again filled with protesters. People were demanding justice not just for Harris, but for all the victims of a system that had oppressed and destroyed innocence for decades. The press was finally beginning to report the truth, and the senator's allies were rushing to leave their posts to deflect suspicion. But even then, Harris felt that something was wrong. Despite everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was another, deeper secret behind it all. The next day, as usual, Harris woke up in his hideout and immediately turned on the news. He was now a little less afraid for his life. Public opinion was on his side again, and the senator had been defeated. But soon the news shook him to his core. The senator had not been arrested. The night before he was to be formally arrested, he was found dead in his home. Initial police reports said it was suicide, but something about that didn't add up. Harris received a call from Jennifer, who was as shocked as he was. She said it was too convenient. The senator's death solved many problems. Before they could discuss the details, they agreed to meet in an hour at a safe place. When Harris arrived at the meeting place, Jennifer appeared nervous but confident. She had a laptop in her hand and immediately showed Harris files that she said had been given to her by an anonymous source. The files contained encrypted documents and audio recordings that suggested the senator's death was not accidental. Harris couldn't believe his eyes. The tapes revealed that the senator was just one of a number of puppets in the hands of a much more powerful figure, a mysterious man named Mason who ran the criminal network from behind the scenes. Mason was the one who really ran the system, the racist structures, the corruption schemes, the political assassinations, including Tyrone's. The senator was just following his orders, but when he started acting out, Mason decided to get rid of him. "This is something new," Harris said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "We thought the senator was the main player, but it turns out he's just a pawn." Jennifer nodded. "I thought so too, but I discovered that this network was much more powerful than we could have imagined. Mason controlled everything, from the police to the courts and even the media. He pulled the strings, holding the entire city in his hands." "What next?" Harris asked, realizing that this was just the beginning of something bigger. "I found something else," Jennifer said, opening the next file. There was a classified program involving dozens of high-ranking officials. It was designed to keep the system in its current state. Their plan was not just to continue the corruption, but to create an entirely new, invisible, and untouchable power structure. Harris realized the scale of the problem. The fight was no longer just against racism and police brutality. It was about an entire system. built into the machinery of the state, ready to destroy anyone who challenged it. But what disturbed him most was the fact that many of those he considered allies were also part of the scheme. Jennifer handed him files that contained several names, prominent politicians, activists, even journalists who purported to fight for justice but were actually working for Mason. "We can't trust anyone," Harris said quietly, "not even those who seem to be on our side." Suddenly, the door to the room where they were swung open. A man in a black suit with an icy gaze stood on the threshold. It was one of the FBI agents who worked with Harris, the same one who had saved his life more than once. "Harris, you must come with me," he said calmly, but there was no trace of friendliness in his voice. "The time for playing these games is over." Harris realized with horror that the agent was part of this network too. He snatched the laptop from Jennifer's hands and ran to the window, trying to escape, but the agent was faster. He grabbed him by the shoulder and pushed him against the wall. "You think you can defeat us?" the agent said quietly. "We've controlled this city for decades. Everything you saw was just a stage in our game. We allowed you to advance because you were useful, but now that you've gotten too close to the truth, you've become a threat." Harris felt his heart squeeze with fear. This was the end, but at the last moment, Jennifer, who was behind the agent, hit him on the head with a metal pipe that was lying nearby. The agent fell to the floor unconscious. "We must run," she shouted. They ran from the room and disappeared into the dark streets of the city. Harris now knew that he was in for a far more dangerous fight than he had ever faced before. The enemies behind racism and corruption were more cunning and powerful than he could have imagined. But despite all this, he knew he couldn't give up. Now he had proof, and he intended to use it to bring down the system once and for all. It was a war in which the stakes were higher than ever before, and Harris knew that a new, even more deadly turn of events lay ahead. For days, Harris and Jennifer hid in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, trying to figure out what to do next. They held in their hands one of the most important revelations in the history of the city, perhaps the country. They knew that if they made the slightest mistake, the system would destroy them, just as it had destroyed those who had stood in the way of the truth before them. Every step was on the line. The FBI agent they had knocked out had probably woken up by now, and now they were being hunted. They had nowhere to turn. Everyone they thought was an ally could be part of this vast network. Even close friends and associates could be involved, and any phone call or meeting could put their lives at risk. "We need a plan," Harris said, thinking out loud. "We can't just hide forever. If they find us, it's all over. But if we give the wrong information, they might destroy us before the truth comes out." Jennifer thought about it. She was tense, but her sharp mind quickly analyzed the situation. "We have two options," she began. "Either we go to an independent journalist we can trust and try to get the story through them, or," she paused for a moment, as if considering something risky, "or we go direct and publish it ourselves. But if we choose the latter, we need to be prepared for them to hit hard and fast." Harris knew that the first option, while safer, could take too long. They had already seen how easily the system manipulated the media and public opinion. Every day counted. "I think we have to go for broke," he finally said. "We don't have time for slow moves. We can't rely on anyone but ourselves." Jennifer agreed, and soon they began to formulate a plan. Time passed, but they decided to take one decisive step, to gather as much corroboration, evidence, and testimony as possible about the crimes of Mason and his network. They had to contact other activists who had helped them in the past, as well as several police whistleblowers willing to risk their lives for the truth. But things took an unexpected turn when the next day, Harris received a mysterious email from an anonymous sender. It contained only one sentence: "We know what you're looking for, but you don't know the whole truth yet." Attached to the email was a video file, and the contents of the file shocked him to the core. Mason himself was on the tape, but not in his usual cold, ruthless puppeteer persona. He was speaking with anxiety and fear, in the background of his conversation with the voices of others, among whom Harris recognized some of the city's influential people. They were discussing more than just current conspiracies and corruption schemes. The conversation was about something much deeper and more sinister. "We were just part of the plan." Mason's voice was tight. "They've been standing over us this whole time. We're just cogs in their system, and if we don't comply, they'll destroy us." They did it to others, and they'll do it to us. Harris couldn't believe his ears. Whoever was behind Mason and his network was even more powerful. This network extended further than he could have imagined, not just local politics and law enforcement, but nationally, perhaps even internationally. He showed the footage to Jennifer, and they both realized that their opponents weren't just a group of corrupt officials. The system they were fighting was part of a larger power structure that had interests in every sphere: politics, economics, even the military and intelligence services. They were the ones pulling the strings that ran Mason and the city. This isn't just corruption, Jennifer said. This is a real shadow power, and they're ready to destroy anyone who gets close to their secrets. Harris realized that the fight had become even more dangerous, but he also realized that they now had a chance to bring down not just the local network, but the entire system if they released the information correctly. They decided to act immediately. Jennifer and Harris established contact with a hacker group that specialized in leaking classified information. Over the next few days, they prepared a massive data dump on the internet. Evidence, documents, audio recordings, everything had to be published at the same time, so that no one could stop it. But just hours before it was supposed to happen, Jennifer received a message that made their hearts skip a beat. Her parents, who lived in another state, had been found dead. The note left at the crime scene had one sentence: "Stop before it's too late." Harris saw tears well up in Jennifer's eyes, but she didn't flinch. "They think they can scare us," she whispered, "but I won't stop. This isn't just about truth anymore. This is revenge." They decided to go all the way, despite the threats. That same evening, the information was published. The internet exploded. The media could not respond to such a volume of revelations. The global network of corruption and manipulation was in full view, but the most shocking was yet to come. Just when Harris and Jennifer thought they had a chance to win, another unexpected twist occurred. Instead of hiding, Mason suddenly appeared live on one of the national TV channels. In an interview, he smiled and said that all the accusations against him were just part of a carefully planned campaign to discredit his character. "I am the victim of a huge conspiracy," he said, looking straight into the camera. "It was an attempt to destroy me and my comrades, but I am going to fight to the end. The real criminals are those who are now trying to tarnish my name." Harris stared at the screen in horror. Mason had turned the tables and now looked like the victim. Public opinion was beginning to shift again. "They did it," he said quietly. "They won again." But Jennifer squeezed his hand. "This isn't the end," she said. "We'll find a way. We have to." The days following Mason's revelation were a nightmare for Harris and Jennifer. Contrary to their expectations, the wave of public anger caused by the leak quickly subsided. People began to doubt that the documents were real. Mason used all his connections to portray himself as the victim of a conspiracy, portraying Harris and Jennifer as participants in a large-scale provocation. The television networks that initially covered the revelations suddenly began to change their rhetoric, talking about questionable evidence and possible falsification. Harris paced the room, feeling despair grip his heart. "They control everything," he said, looking at the TV screen, where Mason was showing again. "We gave the world proof. And what? It didn't change anything. This is their last card." Jennifer tried to calm him down. "If they can't stop us completely, they'll try to discredit us." But even she felt the fear and helplessness growing. They felt like the truth they had been searching for was simply drowning in a swamp of lies and manipulation. And yet, every day, innocent black people were being arrested on the streets. Harris saw news reports of new cases of racist brutality, of white police officers using force against minorities with impunity, and he knew that the fight had only just begun, but was already spiraling out of control. One night, while they were hiding in yet another hideout, there was a knock at the door. Harris's heart sank. It could have been the police, the FBI, or even someone hired by Mason. Jennifer pointed a gun they'd found on one of their allies at the door. Harris quietly approached. "Who's there?" he asked tensely. There was no answer, only another knock. Finally, Harris slowly opened the door and saw an old woman with deep wrinkles and dark, piercing eyes standing on the threshold. She was black and looked as if she carried the weight of history on her shoulders. The woman stood in a dark cloak, leaning lightly on a cane. "Are you Harris?" she asked quietly but firmly. Harris nodded, though he didn't know who she was or what she wanted. The woman stepped inside, removing her hood to reveal her face. Jennifer stood at the ready, holding her gun, but something about the woman inspired confidence. "I know why you fight," she said, sitting down on a chair. "I know you've discovered a secret that can change everything." Harris and Jennifer exchanged glances. "Who are you?" Jennifer asked. "My name is Martha," the woman said, "and I've come to tell you a truth you don't yet know. Your fight isn't just against Mason, it's against an entire system that was created centuries ago to oppress people like me. I'm not here because you can defeat Mason. I'm here to tell you that he's just one of many, and his power extends beyond this town." Harris and Jennifer listened intently, sensing that something more than just current events was crashing down on them. "Mason is a descendant of one of the oldest families to profit from slavery," Martha continued. "Their roots run deep in a history of racism and discrimination. These families still rule the world, maintaining a system that oppresses people based on the color of their skin. These aren't just random acts of racism, they're an elaborate structure that maintains social and economic barriers. You've only uncovered the tip of the iceberg." Harris felt his heart beat faster. Everything he thought, everything he knew, was only a small part of a much larger problem. "But why did you come to us?" he asked, trying to comprehend the scale of what he had heard. "Because you have a chance," Martha said, her voice firm. "You've already touched this system, and even though they're trying to destroy you now, you've created a rift, but that rift must become a chasm. You haven't just exposed one corrupt politician, you've made people see the centuries of oppression behind it. Now you have to hit harder." "How can we do this?" Jennifer asked desperately. "They beat us to it. Public opinion is turned against us again." Martha slowly stood up and headed towards the exit, but before leaving, she turned around and said, "History is on your side. The strength is that the truth always comes to the surface, even if they try to drown it in blood. But to win, you have to show people that this fight is not just about the two of you. It is the fight of every oppressed person. It is the fight of black people, the poor, those who have never had a voice. And only when everyone understands that this concerns them personally, you will be able to destroy this system." She left as quietly as she had come, leaving Harris and Jennifer lost in thought. Her words were like a hammer, smashing the last vestiges of their fear. "She's right," Harris said as silence filled the room. "We have to do this not just for us. We have to tell people that systems of oppression are not abstract. They are realities that happen every day." "But how?" Jennifer asked. "They control the media. They control everything." "We will find a way," Harris said confidently, feeling a new strength awakening within him. "We will awaken those they have silenced. We will find those who have been broken by the system and make them speak." Now their struggle was no longer just personal, it was part of something bigger. Harris and Jennifer moved quickly. Instead of relying on the media or hackers, they decided to take a different approach. They reached out to local civil rights leaders and activists and began organizing meetings with victims of police violence and racism. They realized that their power lay not in secret documents or incriminating files, but in the voices of people who had been silenced by the system for centuries. Drop by drop, they collected these testimonies not just from their city, but from across the country. Every story of oppression, every evidence of cruelty and injustice, became part of a mosaic they intended to present to the world. Harris and Jennifer began recording these stories and sharing them on social media, creating a wave that no system of control could stop. Other whistleblowers began to join them, black police officers who had remained silent about abuses for years, journalists who had seen their newsrooms suppress important stories, teachers who taught children in schools where their own history was edited out of textbooks. Soon, hundreds of people were speaking out, and the avalanche was unstoppable. One night, a few weeks into their new campaign, Harris received a call from an unknown number. "It's urgent," said the voice on the other end of the line. "We'll meet in an hour. It concerns everything." Harris and Jennifer were on the edge again, fear always hanging over them like a shadow, but they could no longer retreat. When they arrived at the abandoned warehouse, they saw the same woman, Martha, but now she was not alone. There were people standing next to her that Harris had not seen before. They were dressed in business suits, looked confident, but there was anxiety in their eyes. "What happened?" Harris asked, not understanding why they had been called here so urgently. Martha stepped forward. "It's just beginning," she said quietly. "You've done your job, your movement has grown, and now it's bigger than you ever imagined, but there's something you need to know." Harris and Jennifer stood frozen in anticipation. "Mason," Martha began, "is not just a puppet of the system, he is part of a much more complex game, and his true role was revealed only recently. When you began to spin the truth about his network, someone used it against him. You unknowingly drew him into a trap." "What do you mean?" Jennifer asked. "Mason tried to control the corruption and violence using the old methods, but he became too dangerous for those above him. The people who run everything are using him as a scapegoat. Your information accelerated the process, but now he is being destroyed by those even more powerful. Mason is just a pawn. So they're just going to dump him and let everything go on as before?" Harris said, barely containing his anger. "Not exactly," Martha said. "Their plan is to create the illusion of justice. They'll arrest Mason, maybe even stage a big trial, showing everyone that the system works. But once everyone calms down, those behind him will simply put someone new in his place." Harris felt a chill creep up his spine. He knew it all. Even if Mason was taken out, nothing would change. "We were trying to stop one man, but we found ourselves fighting a whole machine," he muttered. "But you have a chance," Martha interrupted. "Right now, when they're distracted, you can strike. Their attention is focused on saving their position. But if you keep up the pressure, if the people don't shut up, the machine could break down." Jennifer grabbed Harris's hand and he saw determination in her eyes. "We won't stop," she said. "We'll go to the end." Over the next few weeks, events unfolded rapidly. Mason's arrest became big news, his trial a media spectacle. But by this point, the movement Harris and Jennifer had started had become so powerful that attempts to cover up the scandal no longer worked. People saw something bigger behind the facade of justice, an exposed network that had sustained a system of oppression for centuries. But the real blow came from an unexpected twist. On the day Mason was to stand trial, a leak occurred that shocked everyone, an audio recording that revealed the names of those really behind the system. People no one expected, big businessmen, judges, politicians in the highest positions. The leak blew everything up. Now no one could deny the truth. Public anger reached its peak. Mason, standing in the courtroom, looked less like a defendant than a victim of the same system he had served so faithfully. At the last moment, when he was asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he suddenly changed. His gaze became cold and desperate. "You all think I'm evil," he said, "but the real villains are the ones who keep you all in fear. I was just their tool, but they will break you just as they broke me." There was silence in the room, and then a scream. Jennifer, standing in the crowd, felt a wave of determination rise in her heart. This was the turning point. Everything had changed. People could no longer turn a blind eye to the truth. In the months that followed, mass protests began. A system that had oppressed people based on race and social status for centuries began to crumble under the weight of its own sins. Harris and Jennifer were no longer lone warriors. They were part of a new movement that demanded real justice, not show trials and arrests. At the end of that struggle, they stood in the city's main square, looking at the thousands of people who had come out to demand change. There was no longer fear in Harris's eyes, only the certainty that, despite everything, they had finally achieved victory. Friends, it is very important for us to know what you think about this story. Which moments touched you the most? What struck you or evoked emotions? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is worth its weight in gold to us. We strive to create content that touches on important topics and resonates, and your feedback helps us become better. You are an integral part of our community, and every comment and support you provide really matters. We appreciate each and every one of you.